He is a man with no honor. He has no dignity. Let me start with this. The first stanza of the Ranger Creed. Recognizing that I volunteered as a ranger, fully knowing the hazards of my chosen profession, I will always endeavor to uphold the prestige, honor, and high esprit de corps of my ranger regiment. This statement comes at the beginning of what is that Ranger Creed, and it illustrates one difference between what we think about when we talk about dignity and honor. Honor is a complicated phrase or a complicated word. It's one of those things that means so much to so few and so little to so many. But that might actually not necessarily be design, but the reality of the world we live in. See how oftentimes this podcast delves within the depths of gun culture, but also exists within the greater society that we live in. Perhaps we are beset with the problem of we want a dignity, or we want an honor culture, but live in a dignity society. And no book illustrates this better, as far as I've read, than Why Honor Matters by Somers, by Tamler Somers. And so today we're going to talk about both honor and dignity, and how honor exists within the microcosm, the smaller scale, whereas dignity is what we typically engage in on the macro. We might see this in our community versus our country. We might see this in gun culture versus gun owners as a whole, or in the military with our unit and the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps as a whole, and you could even scale out further to the military itself. And while this is a topic about gun culture, and we get to talk about things that are, well, germane to the issues that prevail us, we also have to recognize that these ideas have consequences. If we mix up the two, if we treat an honor culture as a dignity society, or we try to treat a dignity society as an honor culture, there are consequences for us as individuals. And while it may be a bit more of a heady topic, I hope that you will stay along on this episode of the Redacted Culture Cast as we engage into the minutiae behind what we think about what is right and true and good when it comes to honor, dignity, and violence. And while it's a subject of gun culture, this episode has been sponsored by Obsidian Arms, and you may have heard me talk about them for a while. They are the first in, best dressed sponsor for this Redacted Culture Cast, and they present a multitude of options, whether you're looking at competing better in USPSA or IDPA, or you are looking at becoming more self-sufficient when it comes to the tools in your toolbox. Finally, for those entrepreneurs among us, if you are trying to bring something that will probably require some metalworking into the industry, if you're trying to bring something to market, I suggest you reach out to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. And for those who follow our newsletter, which is the Dead Drop, there is a discount. And for those who support the show over at our Black site, there is a heavier one. That being the case, let's get into this topic, which has been sitting heavy on my mind for some days. The subject of honor, as well as dignity, exists strongly within the philosophical field of ethics. But what it draws from is something much deeper, which is metaphysics. And as much as philosophy might come across to many people as some sort of art form where we, illustrate beautiful ideas that go nowhere in reality, this is an example of where how we think about life and what we think is right and true and good, in fact, philosophy does have consequences on our society, our communities, and ourselves. Let's start with the difference between dignity and honor. Dignity is a term. It's a term referring to the moral status of an individual, but so is honor. And they approach this system very differently. Honor, as illustrated by Jack Donovan in The Way of Men, does illustrate how there is a personal component to it. There's a relational component to it. Who you know, how they respect you, do they respect you, what have you done to earn the respect of your peers? Whereas dignity is a much different system that starts with the individual and what we talk about when it comes to rights. See, dignity is the language of rights, but how do you exist in a world of rights, such as the American system with our Bill of Rights, while also understanding or existing within a framework where honor matters? See, we want the honor of our peers. I think this is natural. I don't think this is a vainglorious attempt at earning the respect of our peers. I think there's something more deep than that and much more fulfilling than simply a status check in a bureaucrat's ledger. That might be a betrayal of what's to come, but dignity is a term that refers to the moral status of the individual. And the shortest way, the quickest way, and I think one of the more accurate ways of looking at a dignity system versus an honor system is to look at, say, a glass of water. Like said, in an honor system versus in a dignity system, you start with your glass empty or half full. You can add water to it, or you can remove water from it. You can add honor, or you can lose honor. You can do things that are honorable to your tribe, your nation, well, not even nation, but you can add honor to your tribe, your community, your culture, your family. But you can also do things that are dishonorable, where they remove honor. You become a dishonorable character. A dignity culture is very different. Your glass starts full. You are born, like all other men, with a full glass of dignity. But if you do certain things, you lose that dignity and there's no way to get it back. And the world that we live in, at least in America, is a combination of the two. Our legal system exists on a dignity society, but we as individuals, with our desire for community and belonging, hunger for that honor culture. Can you foster it? Can you lead it? Can you develop it? Where does that lead us? Dignity is something that exists as a whole, and the title of the episode is supposed to give it away. We in America exist within a dignity society, but our own individual communities are honor cultures. It might be your neighborhood, your small town, your borough, your county, even in some sense. But if we're to look at your legal status across the country, do you have felonies? Do you have a secret clearance? Do you have certain positions? And have you done things to reduce that perspective? One way, if you've bought a firearm in the last 10 years, is looking at the 4473, the background check. It doesn't exactly look and determine whether or not you are an honorable person in your community. It just asks if you have sacrificed your dignity, in fact, more importantly, forfeited your right to own a firearm by committing certain acts or being determined as certain things. We might argue the minutia of whether that is justified to begin with, but it does stand in the way that that system works. Honor, if we were to even break it down a little bit further into what many of you exist in this podcast, the gun culture, we might look at the gun culture as within itself an honor culture where you can gain and lose honor. You can do things that are respectable or disrespectful, things that are honorable or dishonorable, joining the army, serving on an important deployment, having certain experiences might gain your honor. Proving your honor in battle is one thing, but then you can also do things that are dishonorable, like being a coward, running from a fight, or committing certain actions within the framework of gun culture that are considered dishonorable. Some people might say a negligent discharge, or others might say cheating on your wife. But if you look at the firearms industry as a whole, it's not even just the gun culture, but gun owners as a whole, it functions much more like a dignity culture or dignity society. Again, I'm separating culture from society because I think it's an honor culture versus a dignity society in this framework. And if you look at the gun owners as a whole, if somebody does certain things, they will no longer have the dignity of not only their peers, but the community as a whole. Now we'll get into what happens when you cross the wires or you cross paths and you approach a dignity society as a gun culture, or we're going to talk about a dignity society as an honor culture and what happens when you mistake those two for each other. But let me continue. We see this, not parity, but we see this division, this separation, this distinction manifest at multiple levels within the West. We've already talked about how the gun culture, with its minutia and who knows who and who knows what and who's a part of this and a part of that group, whether it's this community, that community, and you could just pour out names and try to find people, Finance and Maneuver, SupDef, Pharaoh Concepts, Garantham, T-Rex Arms, GBRS Group, whatever. But then you look at gun owners as a whole, and if you were to separate those two, you'd see there's a pretty stark distinction. Another example that many of us have encountered, but might be worth displaying, is how your honor within your unit in the military is very different than your dignity in the military as a whole. Your honor within your unit might be whether or not they think you are courageous and respectful, whether you are capable of the job or you are lazy or a coward or pass on all responsibility to somebody else. But that's something very different than what the UCMJ determines whether or not you have eligibility for advancement. The Army as a whole is still a dignity society. It still is an organization that looks at your record and asks or determines your success going forward, whether or not you check certain boxes and have certain other boxes not checked. The Army has a good conduct medal. However, there are many people who have received the Army Good Conduct Medal despite not really being considered honorable within their unit. You have the tribe versus the collective. You have the community versus the nation. And one more divisive way of how we might illustrate this issue is in the way that crime and violence amongst even ethnic communities in the United States is described on a news basis. See, you might look at the records, you might look at the numbers and the statistics, and statistics never really establish morality. They might reflect it or reflect its compromise, where you have this thing called the black community. Now, this is a muddy topic, but somebody might bring up the question, why are certain people, prominent people of the black community, so offended when a black man is killed by a white police officer? It almost boils down to something as simple as, I can beat up my younger brother, but you can't. I can engage in this type of infighting and conflict in my own community, but you trying to enforce your rules on me is not acceptable. Every weekend you can go to numerous websites and look at the death count in somewhere like Chicago, maybe North Minneapolis, maybe parts of Ohio, or so on and so forth. And much of that crime is what it would be described as black on black crime. But that's not the same thing as white officers committing crimes or doing the right thing in the scenario against somebody that is part of the black community. What you see here is that within the framework that is considered black culture, you have us versus them. You have our community where we can sometimes police our own, whether or not that's effective. Or you have a difference between somebody of our culture committing violence against another person of our culture versus somebody outside of our culture committing violence, whether legally justified or not, is an entirely different topic. And I intended to breach into this subject in its touchy nature by illustrating how you have, or by trying to describe why this is so consistent. You see people, pundits and otherwise, all the time talking about how you want to talk about white on black crime or black on blah, 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 insert ethnic groups. But you could almost break down ethnic groups into their own cultures while separating them from the society as a whole. The law, the code of ethics, the law in a dignity society might not make allowances for the actions within an honor culture, but within that honor culture, those actions of retribution and so forth are fully acceptable. Again, I would recommend reading Why Honor Matters by Tamler Sommers. And you could look at other places too, whether it's kind of the hillbilly issues, not to mention Hillbilly Elegy because I haven't read it, but you look at the way that you have, what is it, white rednecks and black, it doesn't matter because we don't want to turn this into an ethnic issue. We could fall into the trap of maybe neo-Darwinism and try to separate all the ethnicities into their different proclivities, but I think it's more important and more valuable to look at it as an inside group versus outside group violence. Once again, if you've had a younger brother and you've gone to public school, you can pick on your younger brother, but nobody else can. You can address the issues within your culture, but somebody in the greater society cannot. And this comes down to the differences between an honor culture and a dignity society. See, the problem that we might run into with honor is that it doesn't scale. See, honor is a community. It is a group of people who are earning each other's respect or losing it, determined by the circumstances. And honor has a certain problem. That, again, being that it doesn't scale. I can respect you because you are my brother, or whatever the term is, my comrade in some circumstances, or even my fellow gun culture person. But if somebody comes from outside my honor group and tries to attack somebody in my community, it doesn't work. How does this is exactly where it doesn't scale. Honor is dependent on relationships, whereas dignity is more of a code of ethics or a legal system that covers the whole. And they do have conflict, or at least they do have tension. Dignity functions in our legal system, and this is reflected in how the American legal system considers an individual innocent until proven guilty. It's not enough that your peers accuse you of something. It has to be adjudicated in a court of law. There has to be jurors or a judge or some other matter. But even if those things don't come to pass, you are still considered innocent. But if you do earn that conviction, probably not the right way of saying it, but you'll forgive me, if you do become convicted of something, then you forfeit certain rights. Rights is the language of a dignity society. It is not the same language of an honor culture. A dignity society, the idea of dignity, as we talked about, the glass starts full and you can only remove water, you can't add to it, is that each person is innocent until proven guilty. You might draw back even to the arguments between Rousseau and Locke, or the actions of the individual being, is a person by nature good, corrupted by a nurture or a society that is evil, or are they by nature evil and society attempts to restrain them? We might have to go into a longer detail about Rousseau versus Locke and the American Revolution versus the French Revolution, but we do not have time for that in this episode. There are some cons, there are some challenges, pros and cons for both the honor culture and the dignity society, or an honor system and a dignity system. But let's start with the one that men, or at least I think Americans, are most hungry for, which is an honor culture, a sense of belonging, the evidence being the desire for community, the desire to belong to something greater than themselves. See, an honor culture has many benefits. If you are a man of honor, people will, your community will see you value you as an individual. They will look at your skill sets, or they might even look at you as a person, as somebody worth investing into, whether it's a mentor or a mentee or a community or maybe even a business. But it also has a dark side, and these are really easy to depict. You might look at the gangs. You might look at how an honor culture can very quickly devolve into a self-isolating gang. It's us or them, us against the world. And that may sound poetic, but ultimately it leads into the degradation of the moral system of those involved. Honor itself is not enough to establish morality, as much as many people have tried. Whether it's Roman systems of honor, Viking systems of honor, gang cultures of honor, or even rogue military kind of groups. One might ask the question of whether or not organizations like the CIA are starting to fall into this trap. But it goes a little bit further. If your society is ruled by an honor culture, then if you're not in the clique, you have no power. We start to see corruption run rampant as people who are betraying the portrayed ethics of the society be defended by those within their honor group. People lying on behalf of one another or betraying the dignity or the ethics of the society as a whole for the sake of defending their friend. It can also turn into protecting people from the rule of law because he's one of us. We might even see this within the halls of Washington. But dignity culture also has its own cons. First of all, the easy pros, the benefits of a dignity culture, is that all men are created equal until they don't, until they're not worthy of that equality. A dignity culture, though, can also devolve into bureaucracy, where the humanity of the individual is lost in the mechanism of the system. It can be lost, the individual's plight, their certain circumstances can be completely looked over for the sake of the mechanism of government. A dignity society very oftentimes will then conclude to trample on the rights of the individual. Most importantly, or most distinctly, when a dignity society, in examples of communism, decided that certain people just weren't people enough. You might quote the Nazis, you might illustrate the Russian communists or the Chinese communists, or pick some issue, and that when dignity is the only mechanism that matters, then people become disconnected from their community. See, we might be all part of a big country, but we still exist within our own families, our own cultures, our own communities. And if we forego all that for the lie of multiculturalism, what we have seen in the last, let's say, 30 years of American life is the massive skyrocketing of suicide, particularly among men. It's not an easy topic, it's not a comfortable topic, but it might be what we have to face when it looks at the dignity society that is America. And you could also argue that the veneer of the dignity society is actually just a collection of different honor cultures, some having more power than others, or some having more authority or more influence, but let's not lose the importance of the distinction between dignity and honor in our own current era. There's another problem that we might face. What happens when you approach an honor culture from the framework of dignity? Well, the most likely answer that you're going to get is your currency is worthless. See, dignity means nothing to those within an honor group. You might say, I am a man too, but if you are not one of the culture, not the cult, the culture, then what does that dignity have to offer? You might be coming at saying, well, I'm a person who can shoot well and I can run fast and I can engage targets effectively, but you don't exist within the honor framework of the gun culture. You don't exist within the framework of the people who you're trying to appease. See, you're trying to barter your current high level of dignity with their system of honor, which, again, oftentimes starts an individual at, if not zero, just a cup half full that you can add to or lose from. A dignity cult, a dignity society, or a dignity position has no power and has no currency within a honor culture. The same, though, goes in the other way. If you say, I'm honored by my peers, but the law states that you have committed these actions, your framework of being honored by your gang, your community, your culture doesn't really stick in that position, in that argument. See, dignity looks at a person more often as a number or as a person who either has dignity or has lost dignity, whereas honor is something that someone might earn back. And in a dignity society, perhaps the worst con or the worst error that you can run into in the negative sense is that you say, I'm a man honored by my peers, and they say, well, your honor means nothing here. But what happens if you approach the dignity society from a position of power, where your honor culture is at the top? Now you start looking at what's called a two-tiered system of government, where people within your honor group are protected from the consequences of their actions. Your dignity brings very little value to the table of an honor culture, but if your honor culture is at the top of a dignity society, then you can get away with things. And thus we engage in the realm of ethics. We might say that you can, that you have the power to, but that doesn't mean it's right. You might have to survive scandal, but that again doesn't mean that it's right. So, as we've illustrated here, a two-tiered system of government might be the consequence of elevating an honor culture to the top of a dignity society. And if you want to integrate into an honor culture, you have to earn the respect of your peers. If you don't, you have no place there. You cannot claim dignity. This has been an episode of the Redacted Culturecast. Thank you for listening. If you want to support us, you can head over to redactedllc.com, or we will catch you soon. And in closing, go forth and conquer.